I personally don't like the idea of tax credits on electric vehicles for a number of reasons. One, there's not much of a market for electric vehicles, and a tax credit of almost anything that's in the retail space really only adds the price to the consumer. If you give somebody $1,000 toward their college education, the cost of college education goes up $1,000. The university does well, the student doesn't do so well. I think the same with a $7,500 tax credit for an electric vehicle. It just costs an electric vehicle to cost $7,500 more dollars, and it doesn't really go to the consumer. It becomes an incentive for the producer or the manufacturer, maybe the salesperson, but more than not, it doesn't really help the market.
So I am a huge proponent for now, and basically my logic is that I have never seen any vehicle technology that didn't start in luxury cars, right? GPS, heated seats, FM radio, had 8 tracks. I mean, how far back do we want to go? They all start in the high-end cars and come down. Electric vehicles have also started in the high-end cars and come down. And they went there because consumers are like, I love the acceleration. I say this as an electric vehicle owner. The acceleration is awesome. I love that I don't have to go to the gas station anymore. My costs have gone down. But there's this tension where you have something that is lowering my costs, right? It is, I've got less, and you've got a surge in demand. Like I'd challenge your point a little bit that they're not popular. They hit 10% of new vehicle sales in 12 years. It took, I think, twice as long for hybrid electric vehicles to get to that level. And you're now seeing, because of those tax credits, a whole bunch of other companies come into the space. So like Tesla is slashing costs because they're losing market share to Hyundai and Kia. The tax credit is a way to make sure that folks who aren't wealthy enough to buy it can get in the door and also have the benefit of paying less for energy.
My biggest problem with the credit side of it, though, is that it doesn't really help the consumer as much as it does the manufacturer, because it's an added cost and it becomes an added price, and the credit doesn't really go to the consumer.
But are you talking about the credit as we did in the IRA, or because the old credit that like Tesla had figured out how to monetize all those credits, but the new one that's payable to the consumer, I'm hard pressed to say. Like, I mean, look at like Tesla's margins are not going up right now, right? But you are seeing a lot of consumers who are getting that benefit.
One thing, and I agree that early technological advancements or emerging technologies that get a little bit of a boost from the federal government oftentimes become able to stand on their own. In the electricity space, your use of hybrids, for example, it took longer for them to get to the place where highly subsidized electric vehicles are. But the market responded to the hybrid. The cost of gasoline and the opportunity to drive a vehicle more efficiently was a natural market reaction as opposed to a hyper incentivized one. I think it's a better example, frankly.
Well, I guess my challenge would be that I'm not sure that there's any part of the energy industry that's fully competitive, right? I mean, there's still, a dozen states in the country where it's illegal for anybody except the regulated utility to sell retail electricity. So if you're going to build out like a charging network, where are you going to build the well, if you own your own house, if you've got a garage, you put your charger in, that's easy. But there's a natural slow pace specifically because of the way that regulation has protected and insulated incumbent monopolies from competition, right? So like I also think frankly, like, I remember years ago when GM did the EV1,
I remember.
People loved them. And then GM discontinued because they were making a higher margin on trucks, right? That wasn't because customers didn't want them, and it took Tesla as a disruptive innovator to produce something that eventually got a subsidy, right? Like the tax credit came in to bring it down, but those first Teslas were not sold with a big tax credit.
No, but and the GM one is an interesting case study to say the least, because that was subsidized in certain states, which made them very popular at the very price of the subsidy. However, since you brought up the electricity market, which is another part of this, which is a pretty challenging part, where I come from in North Dakota, where there are long distances between places and the weather is often very, very cold, we do produce a lot of electricity at a very low cost. And we like to export that electricity that we don't use to neighboring states. But there isn't the generation capacity to meet the goals. The other factor, and let me back up for a second. With regard to regulated utilities, you're right. But remember, a monopoly utility trades its ability to make a larger profit for the privilege of being a monopoly, because we don't want redundant build out of electrical grids and electrical generation. We already have a challenge, and because if you had that in a place like North Dakota, you'd have so much duplication it wouldn't actually bring costs down; it'd bring costs up.
Well, I guess we could go down rabbit holes on regulated utilities. I spent 20 years before coming to Congress in the unregulated utility sector, and I'm a big fan of the old aphorism that asking a utility to interconnect to their grid is like asking a man to date his wife. There are a ton of technologies. Thomas Edison's first power plant, Pearl Street Station, recovered 50% of the fuel energy he put in to make heat and electricity. The fossil-fired grid today is 33% efficient. There is no other industry I can think of that is less efficient at turning raw materials into finished goods than the electric industry. And that's not because they're dumb. It's because we created a model that says you don't make money by providing a lower priced product. You make money by controlling your monopoly and deploying capital. And so as innovation comes along, they're wonderful at keeping the lights on. They're not good at innovation. And so these disruptive technologies don't fit very well into that model and make it not subject to market force.
Having spent 10 years as an energy regulator on the North Dakota Public Service Commission, in a state that generates a lot of electricity as well as consumes a lot of electricity, there are a lot of perverse incentives on the one hand. But my dad was a lineman for the Rural Electric Cooperative. My mother-in-law was on the board of directors of a rural electric cooperative. And I always said to the regulated utilities who complained about having to come to me for their rates because their competitors or their neighbors in the non-regulated side didn't have to, I always would say, well, you ought to try to get a rate increase from my mother-in-law. That's a hell of a lot harder than getting one from me, because you're right, they get to bring in their costs, and they're not guaranteed not only to cover the costs if they can make an evidentiary case for it, but they're guaranteed a slight profit.